I stood in the conference room, every pair of eyes locked on me, as Thomas Keaton smiled that fake sympathetic smile he'd perfected over 15 years of climbing corporate ladders. "Riley has been struggling with compliance accuracy," he said, his voice dripping with manufactured concern. "So effective immediately, she'll be transitioning to a junior audit role while we address these performance issues." The room fell silent. My co-workers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Jennifer from accounting looked away. Marcus pretended to study his laptop. My face burned hot with humiliation as Thomas continued his performance. "We want to support Riley through this transition," he said, still smiling. But I saw it in his eyes. The calculation. The relief. He thought he'd won. What Thomas didn't know was that I knew exactly what compliance error he was talking about. Because 3 weeks ago, he'd begged me to fix the mess he'd made. And I'd refused. Now he was burning my career to save his own skin. My hands trembled as I walked back to my desk, but not from fear. From rage. Because I had something he didn't know existed. If you're watching this video, please like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching my revenge story from. I want to know how far it has traveled. My name is Riley Hart, and 3 weeks before that moment, I had no idea my career was about to be torched to hide my boss's incompetence. I was 32 years old, an audit coordinator at Vanguard Logistics Tech, a mid-sized company that handled supply chain software for retail giants. I'd been there for 6 years, working my way up from data entry to managing compliance audits for our biggest clients. I was good at my job. Detail-oriented. Reliable. The kind of person who caught mistakes before they became problems. My apartment was small but comfortable, paid for by steady paychecks and occasional overtime. My boyfriend Tyler had proposed 2 months earlier, and we were planning a spring wedding. Life felt stable. Predictable. I like predictable. Thomas Keaton was my director, a smooth-talking executive who'd transferred from our Boston office 2 years ago. He was 45, always wore expensive suits, and had a talent for taking credit when projects succeeded and disappearing when they failed. Most people liked him. I found him exhausting but harmless enough. The day everything changed started ordinarily enough. I arrived at the office at 8:30, grabbed coffee from the break room, and settled into my cubicle. My first task was reviewing the quarterly compliance report for Silver Point Retail, our largest client. The file sat in my inbox, flagged as urgent. I opened it and immediately noticed something wrong. The reconciliation numbers didn't match the source documents. Someone had altered the figures by nearly $200,000. My stomach tightened. This wasn't a simple math error. These were deliberate changes to make the audit look cleaner than it actually was. I checked the document properties. Last modified by Thomas Keaton. 2 days ago. At 11:15 at night. I stared at my screen trying to make sense of it. Thomas had override access to all audit files, but he never actually worked on them. That was my job. Why would he be editing compliance documents at 11 at night? I printed the file and compared it to the backup version I'd saved the week before. The differences were stark. Thomas had smoothed over 3 major discrepancies in Silverpoint's inventory tracking, changed classification codes to avoid triggering automated alerts, and backdated approval signatures. This wasn't accidental. This was a cover-up. And it was spectacularly illegal. Felt sick. Our entire business model depended on accurate compliance reporting. If regulators discovered we'd been falsifying audit data, Vanguard would face massive fines. We could lose our certifications. People would lose their jobs. I grabbed my coffee and headed to Thomas's office, documents in hand. His door was open. He was on the phone laughing about something. When he saw me, he wrapped up quickly. "Riley, hey, come in," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "What's up?" I closed the door behind me and placed the printed documents in front of him. "I found some irregularities in the Silverpoint file," I said carefully. "The numbers don't match our source documentation. Someone modified them." Thomas glanced at the papers, his expression unchanged. "Oh, that," he said casually. Yeah, I made some adjustments. I waited for him to explain. He didn't. Thomas, these aren't adjustments, I said, keeping my voice steady. These are material changes to compliance data. The original discrepancies need to be reported. He leaned back in his chair, still relaxed. Riley, you're technically right, but here's the thing. Those discrepancies. They're Silverpoint's problem, not ours. They've got internal issues with their inventory system. If we flag this in the quarterly report, they'll panic, probably fire their logistics team, and blame us for not catching it sooner. But we didn't catch it sooner, I said. We're supposed to report what we find. Thomas's smile thinned slightly. We're also supposed to maintain client relationships. Silverpoint brings in 40% of our revenue. If we embarrass them with their own board, they'll find a new compliance vendor. One that's more collaborative. The word collaborative landed like a threat. You want me to sign off on falsified data? I asked, unable to hide my disbelief. I want you to be a team player, Thomas said, his voice hardening just slightly. Sometimes that means understanding the bigger picture. I stood up, documents still on his desk. I can't do that, Thomas. This violates every standard we're certified under. His expression shifted. The friendly mask dropped completely. Sit down, Riley. I remained standing. Thomas stood too, moving around his desk to close the distance between us. When he spoke again, his voice was low and cold. Let me be very clear. This isn't a debate. I've already handled the Silverpoint situation. The report goes out as written. What I need from you is to process the final approval and move on. With my signature on it, I said. With your signature on it, he confirmed. That's your job. My job is accurate compliance reporting. Your job, Thomas interrupted, is what I tell you it is. And right now I'm telling you to be smart about this. Don't make this difficult. The threat was explicit now. I could feel my heart pounding, but I kept my voice level. I'm not signing off on false data. Thomas's jaw tightened. Then we're going to have a problem. I walked out of his office with my hands shaking. Back at my desk, I tried to focus on other work, but my mind kept circling back to the conversation. Thomas had essentially ordered me to participate in fraud. And when I refused, he'd threatened me. I needed to think. By the next morning I noticed the first change. My weekly status meeting with Thomas was cancelled. No explanation, just removed from my calendar. Then I was excluded from a client call I'd scheduled weeks ago. When I asked Thomas's assistant about it, she looked uncomfortable. Thomas said he'd handle it directly, she mumbled, avoiding eye contact. By the end of the week, the pattern was clear. I was being frozen out. Emails I sent went unanswered. Projects I'd been leading were quietly reassigned. And worst of all, Thomas had started bringing Lila Chen into meetings that were supposed to be mine. Lila was 26, enthusiastic, and hungry for advancement. She joined the audit team 8 months ago, fresh from a compliance certification program. She was competent enough, but she didn't have the experience for senior-level work. I watched from my desk as Thomas walked Lila through a client presentation I'd developed. She took notes eagerly, nodding at everything he said. When they passed my cubicle afterward, Thomas barely acknowledged me. But Lila gave me a sympathetic look that made my stomach drop. She knew something. 2 days later, Lila appeared at my cubicle during lunch, glancing around nervously. "Riley, can I talk to you for a second?" she asked quietly. I gestured to the empty chair beside my desk. She sat down, fidgeting with her coffee cup. "I don't know if I should be telling you this," she began, "but Thomas has been asking me to shadow him on your projects. He said you were, having some personal issues and might be stepping back soon." My blood ran cold. Personal issues. Lila looked miserable. "He said you've been distracted lately. Missing deadlines. Making mistakes. He wanted me to learn your workflows in case you needed time off." I forced myself to stay calm. "Lila, I haven't missed a single deadline. And I haven't made any mistakes. She bit her lip. I know. That's why I'm telling you. After Lila left, I sat at my desk staring at nothing, trying to process what was happening. Thomas wasn't just freezing me out. He was building a narrative, laying groundwork to justify whatever he planned to do next. I thought about going to HR, but what would I say? My boss asked me to falsify compliance data. I refused. And now he's retaliating. Without proof, it would be my word against his. And Thomas was a director with 15 years at the company. I was a coordinator. That night I barely slept. Tyler tried to comfort me, but I couldn't explain what was happening without sounding paranoid. By morning I'd made a decision. If Thomas was building a case against me, I needed to build one back. I arrived at work early before most people, and logged into our audit management system. Every document, every edit, every approval in our system was tracked through an automatic logging system. It recorded user IDs, timestamps, IP addresses, and device identifiers. I'd set up the system myself 3 years ago, but most people forgot it existed. I pulled the access logs for the Silverpoint file. The data was clear and damning. On March 14th at 11:03 p.m., someone using Thomas's login credentials had opened the compliance report. For the next 47 minutes, that user made 17 separate edits to the document, each one logged with precise timestamps. Then, at 11:51 p.m., the same user had accessed my account credentials using director override privileges. At 11:52 p.m., my account was logged as approving the changes. Except I'd been at home that entire night, watching a movie with Tyler. My phone's location data would prove it. Thomas hadn't just edited the report. He'd used his override access to make it look like I'd approved his changes. He'd created a paper trail that pointed directly at me. I felt dizzy staring at the screen. This wasn't just retaliation. This was premeditated. He'd been planning this from the moment I refused to sign off on his falsified data. I downloaded the logs onto a flash drive and saved backup copies to my personal encrypted cloud storage. Over the next week, I operated in 2 modes. Publicly, I remained professional and compliant. I responded to emails, completed assignments, and acted like everything was normal. But privately, I was building a case. I documented every exclusion, every cancelled meeting, every reassigned project. I saved emails where Thomas praised my work before our confrontation, creating a clear before and after timeline. I backed up every file I'd created, every audit report I'd signed, every client communication. I was meticulous, thorough, and completely silent about what I was doing. Thomas seemed to relax. He probably thought I'd accepted my fate, that I'd decided not to fight back. He started getting careless. In a team meeting, he made an offhand comment about performance concerns with certain team members, while looking directly at me. In an email chain accidentally copied to me, he told another director that I was resistant to feedback and possibly looking for new opportunities. He was building his narrative, and I was letting him. 2 weeks after our confrontation, I was called to a meeting with HR. The email came from Diane Foster, the HR business partner for our division. Just a routine check-in about team dynamics, the message said. Nothing about it felt routine. I arrived at Diane's office to find Thomas already there, sitting comfortably in one of the visitor chairs. My heart sank. "Riley, thanks for coming," Diane said with a professional smile. "We just wanted to touch base about how things are going in the audit department." I sat down slowly, keeping my expression neutral. For the next 20 minutes, Diane asked carefully worded questions about my workload, my relationship with Thomas, and whether I felt supported in my current role. Thomas interjected occasionally, his voice full of concern. "I've noticed Riley seems stressed lately," he said. "I've tried to redistribute some of her projects to take pressure off, but she seems resistant to accepting help." It was masterful. He was positioning his retaliation as supportive management. I answered every question calmly and professionally. Yes, I felt supported. No, I wasn't experiencing unusual stress. Yes, I was open to feedback. Diane took notes throughout, nodding sympathetically. When the meeting ended, Thomas left first. As I stood to follow, Diane touched my arm gently. Riley, if there's anything you want to discuss privately, my door is always open, she said. I met her eyes. Thank you, Diane. I appreciate that. As I walked back to my desk, I clutched the folder I'd brought to the meeting. Inside was a printed copy of the audit trail logs, dated and organized. I hadn't shown them to anyone yet, but I'd brought them, just in case. That night I worked late at the office, long after everyone else had gone home. I needed to verify something. Using my system access, I pulled detailed activity reports for every compliance file Thomas had touched in the past 6 months. The pattern was clear. He'd been doing this for a while. Small edits here and there. Nothing massive enough to trigger alerts, but consistent enough to paint a picture. Thomas Keaton had been quietly manipulating compliance data to make client reports look cleaner, probably to improve his own performance metrics and bonus calculations. I was organizing the evidence files on my flash drive when the system sent an alert to my email. Someone had just attempted to access the audit trail logs. The access was denied because the logs were restricted to system administrators, but the attempt was recorded. User ID Thomas Keaton. Time, 9:14 p.m. Device. His office desktop. He was trying to check the logs, which meant he suspected something. My hands froze over the keyboard. If Thomas realized I had copies of the audit trail, he'd accelerate whatever plan he was building. I needed to move faster. I exported the final pieces of evidence I needed, encrypted everything, and sent copies to 3 separate secure locations. My personal cloud storage, my lawyer's encrypted file system, and a trusted friend who worked in IT security at another company. By the time I left the office at 11 p.m., I had a complete, irrefutable record of everything Thomas had done. And he had no idea. The next morning, Thomas called me into his office. The friendly facade was gone completely. "We need to talk about your future here," he said without preamble. I sat down, forcing myself to appear calm even though my pulse was racing. Thomas leaned forward, elbows on his desk, fingers steepled. "Riley, I'm going to be direct with you. The department is restructuring, and I need team members who are collaborative and flexible. People who understand that compliance work isn't just about rigid rules. It's about relationships." I said nothing. He continued. "I'm offering you a choice. You can accept a lateral transfer to the junior audit team, help train Lila to take over your current responsibilities, and we move forward professionally. Or you can resist this transition, and we'll have to address the performance concerns that have been documented over the past few weeks." There it was. The ultimatum. "What performance concerns?" I asked evenly. Thomas slid a folder across the desk. Inside were printed emails, meeting notes, and a formal performance improvement plan. All dated within the last 3 weeks. All painting me as disorganized, resistant to feedback, and making errors in compliance work. My hands tightened on the folder. "These aren't accurate," I said quietly. "They're documented observations," Thomas replied. "From multiple sources." I looked up at him, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I let him see that I wasn't defeated. I was dangerous. "Thomas, before I respond to any of this, I need to mention something," I said, keeping my voice carefully neutral. "I've been reviewing the audit trail logs for our compliance system. The ones that track every document edit, every user access, every override command." His face went completely still. "And I noticed some interesting patterns," I continued, "particularly around the Silver Point file, and several others." The color drained from Thomas's face. His mouth opened then closed. For the first time since I'd known him, Thomas Keaton had nothing to say. I stood up, leaving his performance improvement folder on his desk. "I'll need some time to think about your offer," I said. "I'm sure you understand." I walked out of his office, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. I'd shown my hand, and now everything would accelerate. I was right. Within an hour, Thomas called an emergency meeting with Diane from HR. I wasn't invited, but Marcus told me about it later. The next morning everything changed. I arrived at work to find Thomas standing outside my cubicle. His face red. His usual composure completely shattered. "You have no idea what you've done," he hissed, low enough that only I could hear. Several co-workers glanced over curiously. Kept my expression blank. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said calmly. "You went digging through restricted files," he said, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "That's a violation of data privacy policies. That's grounds for termination." "The audit trail logs aren't restricted," I replied quietly. "They're part of standard compliance documentation. I have system administrator access. I was doing my job." His jaw clenched. "We'll see what HR thinks about that." But before he could say anything else, his phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and whatever he saw made him go pale. Without another word, he turned and walked quickly toward the elevators. I sat down at my desk, hands trembling, and tried to focus on work. 20 minutes later, Diane from HR appeared. "Riley, could you come with me please?" she asked, her expression unreadable. Diane led me to a conference room I'd never been in before. Inside sat Patricia Warren, the Vice President of Operations, and Bernard Hughes, the company's General Counsel. My stomach dropped. This was either very good or very bad. "Please sit down," Patricia said, gesturing to a chair. Her expression was serious but not hostile. "Riley, we've received some concerning information about irregularities in the audit department. We'd like to hear your perspective." I took a breath and made a decision. I told them everything. The Silver Point file. Thomas's demand that I falsify data. My refusal. The retaliation. The systematic exclusion. The false performance documentation. And finally, the audit trail logs that proved Thomas had been manipulating compliance data and using override access to attribute his changes to my account. I spoke for 20 minutes without interruption. When I finished, Patricia and Bernard exchanged glances. "Do you have documentation of any of this?" Bernard asked. Pulled out my flash drive. "Everything. Complete audit trails with timestamps, IP addresses, and device identifiers. Backup copies of original files before modification. Email correspondence. Meeting notes. All of it organized chronologically." Patricia took the flash drive and handed it to Bernard. "We'll need to review this thoroughly," she said. "But I want to be clear about something, Riley. If what you're telling us is accurate, this is extremely serious. Falsifying compliance data could expose this company to regulatory action, client lawsuits, and criminal investigation." "I understand," I said. "That's why I refused to participate." Bernard leaned forward. "Why didn't you come to HR immediately when Thomas first asked you to sign off on falsified data?" It was a fair question. Honestly, I was scared. Thomas is a director. I'm a coordinator. I didn't think anyone would believe me without proof. So I started gathering it. Patricia nodded slowly. "That was probably smart, though I wish you'd felt you could come to us sooner." He paused. "Riley, we're going to need you to stay available over the next few days while we investigate. You're not in any trouble, but we need to verify everything you've told us. Can you do that?" "Of course," I said. As I stood to leave, Patricia added, "And Riley, thank you for bringing this forward. I know that took courage." The next 48 hours were surreal. I came to work but had no actual work to do. Thomas was conspicuously absent. Lila looked terrified every time I walked past her desk. Marcus cornered me in the break room. "What the hell is going on?" he asked. "Thomas got pulled into a meeting yesterday and hasn't been back since. Everyone's freaking out." "I can't really talk about it," I said honestly. On the third day, I was called back to the conference room. This time, Patricia was alone. She looked exhausted. "Riley, we've completed our initial investigation," she began. "And I need to apologize to you on behalf of this company. What Thomas Keaton did was unconscionable. She slid a folder across the table. Inside was a detailed report. The investigation had uncovered not just the silver point manipulation, but a pattern going back 18 months. Thomas had been systematically altering compliance data for multiple clients, always making reports look cleaner than they actually were. He'd been doing it to inflate his performance metrics and secure bonuses. And when those changes were questioned, he'd used his override access to make it look like subordinates had approved them. The audit trail logs you provided were crucial, Patricia continued. They gave us a roadmap to find other instances. We've identified at least 7 separate clients where data was manipulated. The legal team is currently assessing our liability. What happens to Thomas? Asked. Patricia's expression hardened. Thomas Keaton was terminated this morning. He's been escorted from the building. He'll never work in compliance again. We're also considering whether to refer his actions for criminal prosecution. I felt a wave of relief so intense I almost cried. What about me? I asked quietly. Patricia smiled, the first genuine warmth I'd seen from her. Riley, we're offering you Thomas's position. Director of Audit Operations. Significant salary increase. Full benefits package. And a formal apology in your personnel file for everything you endured. I stared at her. You're offering me his job. You've demonstrated exactly the kind of integrity and attention to detail we need in that role, Patricia said. And frankly, after everything you've been through, you've earned it. But something made me hesitate. Thomas's office. His projects. His mess. Did I really want that? Can I think about it? Asked. Patricia looked surprised but nodded. Of course. Take the time you need. That evening I sat with Tyler in our apartment and told him everything. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. So they're offering you a huge promotion, he said finally. But you're not sure you want it. I proved I was right, I said slowly, working through my thoughts. I stood up to someone who tried to destroy my career and I won. But taking his job feels like staying in his shadow. Like I'd still be cleaning up his mess. Tyler squeezed my hand. So what do you want? I realized I'd known the answer all along. The next morning I called Patricia. I appreciate the offer, I told her. But I'd like to propose something different. I've been approached before about joining your internal audit division. I'd like to accept a senior auditor position there instead. Same salary as the director role, but focused on system integrity and fraud prevention. Patricia was silent for a moment. That's actually brilliant, she said. We desperately need someone with your skills in that division. 2 weeks later, I sat in my new office in the internal audit division. It was smaller than Thomas's had been, but it had a window. My new director, Frederick Walsh, was a careful, methodical man who valued accuracy over politics. We'd already identified 3 other potential compliance issues in the first week. I'd also implemented new protocols for the audit trail system, making it impossible for anyone with override access to mask their changes. Every edit was now flagged for review. No more hidden manipulations. Lila had been promoted to senior auditor, reporting to the new audit director they'd hired from outside the company. She stopped by my office one afternoon, looking nervous. Riley, I just wanted to say I'm sorry, she said, for not speaking up sooner. I knew something was wrong, but I was scared. You did speak up, I reminded her gently. When it mattered. That took courage. She smiled gratefully and left. That evening, Tyler and I went to dinner to celebrate my first successful week. As we waited for our food, my phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from Bernard Hughes, the General Counsel. The email was brief but significant. Riley wanted to update you on the Thomas Keaton situation. After reviewing all evidence, we've referred his case to federal investigators. The deliberate falsification of compliance data affecting multiple clients meets the threshold for criminal fraud. You may be contacted for testimony. Additionally, 3 of our affected clients have retained their own counsel and are pursuing civil action against Mr. Keaton personally. Thank you again for your integrity in bringing this forward. Your actions likely saved this company from catastrophic liability. Regards, Bernard. I showed Tyler the email. He read it twice, then looked at me with pride. You know what this means, he asked. Thomas doesn't just lose his job. He's going to lose everything. Thought about that. 3 months ago, I would have felt vindicated by that outcome. But now, sitting in that restaurant with my fiancé, knowing I had a job I actually respected and colleagues who valued integrity, I mostly felt tired. I hope he learns something from it, I said finally. But mostly, I'm just glad it's over. Tyler raised his glass. To new beginnings. 6 months later, I stood in front of the executive board presenting my findings on systemic compliance gaps across the company. Patricia Warren sat in the front row, nodding approvingly as I outlined recommendations for stronger oversight protocols. When I finished, the CEO himself thanked me personally. This is exactly the kind of proactive work we need, he said. As I walked back to my office afterward, I passed the audit department. The new director had implemented the changes I'd recommended. The team looked busy but not stressed. Lila waved at me through the glass wall. Everything looked normal. Healthy. I thought about Thomas sometimes, usually when I reviewed audit trails and found genuine errors that needed addressing. I wondered if he understood yet that cutting corners doesn't make you successful, just makes you eventually caught. My phone buzzed with a text from Tyler. Dinner tonight. Celebrating 6 months in your new role. I smiled and typed back. Absolutely. As I settled back at my desk, I looked at the framed quote I'd hung on my wall the day I started this position. Integrity is doing the right thing, even when no one is watching. I'd learned the hard way that someone is always watching. Sometimes it's the audit trail. Sometimes it's your own conscience. And sometimes that's enough. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done in such a situation? Please share below and subscribe to this channel for more stories like mine.